Breaking tonight, Washington just published something extraordinary. Not a tweet, not a press conference, an official government document that reads like a threat letter to the entire world, including Canada. And dear viewers, they put our name in it. I'm holding a copy of America's newly released National Security Strategy, released just days ago on December 4th, roughly 30 pages long, official government publication, and buried in the diplomatic language is something that should alarm every Canadian from Vancouver to St. John's. The United States has stopped pretending. They've put in writing exactly how they view us, not as friends, not as neighbors, but as tools to be used in their economic war with China. Let me be direct with you. When a superpower writes down its threats, when it publishes its demands, when it stops using diplomatic language and starts using the language of coercion, that's not strategy. That's a warning. And Canada just received one. The question isn't whether this document is troubling. The question is what Canada does next. Because here's what makes this moment unprecedented. Canada now has a prime minister who saw this coming. Mark Carney, sworn in back in March, has spent the last 9 months preparing for exactly this scenario. And between Washington's threats and Ottawa's preparations lies the entire future of Canadian sovereignty. Washington, December the 4th, 2025. The White House releases its national security strategy. Standard practice, happens every few years, usually ignored by most people. But this one is different. This one names names. This one makes demands. And this one tells Canada exactly what our role is supposed to be in America's vision for the world. Translation: you work for us now. The document mentions Canada exactly once. Not to praise our partnership, not to celebrate shared values, not to acknowledge the longest peaceful border in world history. No. We get mentioned in a single paragraph, lumped together with Europe, Japan, Korea, Australia, and Mexico, all of us listed as countries that America must encourage to adopt trade policies against China. Read that again. Must encourage, not work with, not consult with, must encourage. The language of a boss giving orders to employees. The language of an empire instructing its provinces. The language that tells you everything you need to know about how Washington actually sees Ottawa. Here's the exact quote. We have made clear to our allies that America's current account deficit is unsustainable. We must encourage Europe, Japan, Korea, Australia, Canada, Mexico, and other prominent nations to adopt trade policies to help rebalance China's economy towards household consumption. Dear viewers, let me translate what that actually means in plain English. It means Tariff China. It means cut trade with Beijing. It means sacrifice your economic interests for American strategic goals. It means do what we tell you, when we tell you, because we told you. And if you don't, well, the document makes that clear too, but here's what they didn't count on. Canada has been watching. And more importantly, Canada has been preparing. Because when Mark Carney became Prime Minister back in March 2025, he walked into office with one clear message that every Canadian understood. The old rules are finished. In his victory speech, standing before Liberal supporters in Ottawa, Carney said something that defined his entire approach. The system of open global trade anchored by the United States, a system that Canada has relied on since the Second World War, is over. At the time, it sounded dramatic. Now, 9 months later, reading this American strategy document, it sounds like prophecy. Translation: Canada saw exactly what was coming, and Canada started preparing. Look at what's actually happening on the ground, not in Washington's fantasy document, but in real Canadian policy. The Indo-Pacific strategy, launched in late 2022 under Trudeau. Trade missions to Japan, Korea, Southeast Asia. Canadian officials meeting with Asian leaders, not occasionally, but systematically. Infrastructure investments in West Coast ports. Pipeline proposals heading west, not south. Every single one of those moves looked random at the time. Until you read America's demands. Then suddenly, it all makes sense. Canada wasn't just diversifying for economic reasons. Canada was building insurance against exactly this scenario. The scenario where Washington stops asking and starts demanding. And when Carney took office in March 2025, he didn't reverse course. He accelerated. The message from Ottawa became crystal clear. Canadian prosperity will not require American permission. The document gets worse. Much worse. Because it's not just about China policy, it's about everything Canada produces, everything Canada exports, everything Canada decides. Listen to this line. The United States must protect and defend our economy and our people from harm from any country or source. This means ending threats against our supply chains that risk U.S. access to critical resources, including minerals and rare earth elements. Sounds reasonable, right? Protect supply chains, national security, standard stuff. Except Canada is one of America's largest suppliers of critical minerals. Canada supplies rare earth elements. Canada controls resources that American industry absolutely needs. So what happens when Canada decides to sell those resources to someone else? What happens when a Canadian mining company signs a deal with a Chinese manufacturer? What happens when Ottawa approves a project that sends Canadian resources west instead of south? According to this document, that's a threat against supply chains. That's something America must defend against. That's grounds for American economic pressure, American tariffs, American retaliation. Translation: your resources aren't really yours, they're ours. And if you disagree, we have tools to remind you. January 20th, 2025. President Trump, freshly inaugurated, immediately threatens Canada with tariffs. 25% on everything. The justification: fentanyl, border security, vague national security concerns. But read this document released 11 months later, and you see the real strategy. This isn't about fentanyl. This is about establishing dominance. This is about making Canada think twice before pursuing independent trade policy. This is about punishment for even considering alternatives to American markets. And here's what makes it brilliant from Washington's perspective. They don't have to specify. They don't have to prove anything. The document literally says, America must defend against propaganda, influence operations, and other forms of cultural subversion. Remember when Ontario ran tourism ads in the United States back in October 2023? Remember how Trump exploded? Remember how trade negotiations immediately froze? That wasn't an overreaction, that was precedent. Because according to this new document, Canadian advertising can be classified as cultural subversion threatening American interests. Think about that. A tourism ad becomes a national security threat. Because when you write your definitions broadly enough, anything becomes a threat. Anything becomes grounds for retaliation. But while Washington threatens, Ottawa has moved. Because here's what the document reveals that Washington doesn't want you to see. The threats are loud because the leverage is slipping. Why does America need to encourage allies to tariff China? Because those allies are already doing business with China. Why does America need to threaten Canada over supply chains? Because Canadian companies are already exploring Asian markets. Why does America need to write all of this down in an official strategy document? Because the old system, where America spoke and everyone listened, is collapsing. The document reads like strength. It's actually confession of weakness. Why does America need to encourage allies to tariff China? Because those allies are already doing business with China. Why does America need to threaten Canada over supply chains? Because Canadian companies are already exploring Asian markets. Why does America need to write all of this down in an official strategy document? Because the old system, where America spoke and everyone listened, is collapsing. The document reads like strength. It's actually confession of weakness. Carney understands this. Every speech he gives, every interview, every public appearance since taking office in March, the message is consistent. Canada is a trading nation. Canada needs multiple markets. Canadian prosperity cannot depend on American goodwill. The old relationship with the United States based on deep economic integration is over. Translation: we see your threats. We're building around them. November 2024, Rio de Janeiro. Before Carney even took office, the groundwork was being laid. Prime Minister Trudeau sits down with Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba at the G20 summit. Topic: energy, resources, long-term supply agreements. Japan needs what Canada produces. Canada needs markets that aren't subject to Trump's mood swings. The public statements focused on security cooperation. But the real conversation? How to build trade relationships that don't root through American approval. See the pattern? While America writes threats, Canada builds alternatives. While Washington demands loyalty, Ottawa creates options. While Trump issues ultimatums, Canadian officials strategize. This is how you respond to empire. Not with anger, not with confrontation, with patience, with planning, with partnerships that make American leverage less relevant every single quarter. The document reserves special contempt for Europe, pages and pages criticizing European policy, European regulations, European civilization itself. Civilizational erasure, they call it, as if the continent that gave us democracy, universities, although and the Enlightenment needs lectures from a country that can't figure out universal healthcare. But that European section reveals something crucial for Canada. America is losing patience with everyone, not just rivals, allies, partners. Anyone who doesn't immediately align with Washington's vision gets threatened, criticized, or labeled unreliable. Translation: if they'll write this about Germany and France, ancient allies with deep military ties, what protection does Canada have? The answer: none. The document says it explicitly. Some European countries may not be worthy of remaining US allies. Think about that language. Worthy. As if alliance is something America grants or revokes based on obedience. Canada should read that section very, very carefully, because we're next on that list if we don't comply with their China demands. But here's where it gets interesting. The document accidentally reveals America's real fear. It's not military. It's not even primarily security. It's economic. It's the terror of a superpower watching its economic dominance slip, watching other countries succeed, watching the world become multipolar. Listen to how they describe China's rise. China adapted by strengthening its hold on supply chains. China exports to low-income countries doubled between 2020 and 2024. That's not a description of cheating. That's a description of competition. China built supply chains. China found markets. China succeeded. And America, instead of competing better, writes a document demanding that allies help them punish success. For Canada, this is clarifying. Because if America's solution to competition is coercion, if their response to market forces is tariffs and threats, then Canadian prosperity absolutely cannot depend on American markets alone. Translation: they're telling us exactly why diversification isn't optional. It's survival. Carney hasn't said this explicitly in response to this document yet. It just dropped days ago. Too recent, too fresh, but the policy speaks for itself. 9 months in office, every trade mission, every infrastructure investment, every conversation with Asian partners. The subtext is clear. Canada is building a future where American approval is helpful, but not necessary. Because here's the fundamental choice this document forces on Canada. Accept subordination, accept being told who to trade with, who to sell to, what policies to adopt, accept being a province in America's empire, or build alternatives, build partnerships, build trade routes that don't run through American approval, build an economy that succeeds because of Canadian competitiveness, not American permission. One path is comfortable in the short term, the other is hard work, but only one path leads to actual sovereignty. And Carney made his choice clear back in March, in his very first speech as Prime Minister. We are masters in our own home. We can control our destiny. So what happens next? America has published its strategy. The threats are in writing. The demands are explicit. Canada is named. The pressure is real. And Ottawa's response is already clear. Carney addressed this in his March victory speech, and he hasn't wavered since. My government will keep our tariffs on until the Americans show us respect and make credible, reliable commitments to free and fair trade. The easy path is compliance. Tariff China. Restrict trade, follow American orders. Keep Washington happy, hope the threats stop. The hard path is independence. Continue diversification, build Asian partnerships, invest in Western infrastructure, accept American pressure in exchange for Canadian autonomy. Carney represents that second path, not loudly, not dramatically, but clearly. Every speech about Canadian competitiveness, every comment about multiple markets, every emphasis on national interest over alliance loyalty. And now, with this document in hand, every Canadian can see exactly why that path matters. Translation: the choice is simple. Be a subordinate or be a sovereign nation. You can't be both. Dear viewers, this document isn't just policy analysis, it's a test. A test of whether Canada will accept being treated as a tool in someone else's strategy. A test of whether we'll sacrifice long-term prosperity for short-term comfort. A test of whether Canadian leaders will choose sovereignty or subordination. The threats are real. The pressure is intense. The risks are significant, but the opportunity is historic. Because when an empire demands obedience, when it publishes threats, when it stops pretending about partnership, it reveals something crucial. It reveals that your choices actually matter. Your independence actually threatens them. Your alternatives actually work. Washington published this document to intimidate. They might accomplish the opposite. They might have just given Canada the clearest possible reason to build a future that doesn't require American permission. The question isn't whether America has power. They do. The question is whether power equals legitimacy, whether threats equal partnership, whether Canada accepts their definition of our role. Mark Carney is betting we don't. The Indo-Pacific strategy is betting we don't. Every trade mission, every infrastructure project, every conversation with non-American partners is betting we don't. And if you're watching this video, if you made it this far, if you understand what's actually at stake here, then you're part of that bet too. Because Canadian sovereignty isn't something governments grant. It's something citizens demand. And every time someone understands these patterns, every time someone sees past the threats to the opportunities, every time someone chooses clarity over fear, that sovereignty gets stronger. So here's my question for you. Not rhetorical, real. What does Canadian independence actually look like? What partnerships make sense? What risks are worth taking? Drop your thoughts in the comments, especially if you're watching from Europe, from Asia, from anywhere facing similar American pressure. Because this isn't just Canada's challenge. This is the challenge of every country watching a superpower publish its threats and wondering whether they have alternatives. The answer, dear viewers, is yes. Alternatives exist. They're being built right now, quietly, professionally, patiently. And documents like this, threatening as they sound, are exactly why that work matters.